Fathers, thank you. Again, we just lift up Dwight to you in particular, and that family. Their whole situation is they have really great plans for Thanksgiving and getting together. We just pray that his health will meet that opportunity. Again, help us to come alongside them in exactly the ways that they need help. Let the body of Christ work for them. And then I pray that you be with me as I go through the material. Lord, help me just to do an excellent job with it. In your son's name, amen. Okay, so we are on to Genesis 38. And we've often talked about, there are going to be, again, a lot of notes in this section. I'll put the notes pages up for the last handful of lessons here pretty soon. But we've often talked, we started last time that Genesis 38 is often seen as an interruption in the narrative of the Joseph cycle. And what I wanted to go off and basically the whole reason we're taking this literary approach is I want to make sure, because when we get to this chapter, I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that this chapter's placement and its material is intentional. This isn't something where somebody in the Babylonian period decided, hey, King David ended up being the king. Let's talk about all the people in his family line. So Judah has got this weird story. Ruth has got this weird story. Let's just start this, insert these things into the Bible. And so we want to go through these connections. And this is one of the reasons why we've done stuff on like repetition, word motifs, and structure. And structure is really going to be important to us as we lean into that. Of course, the question coming into these chapters, remember, this is what becomes a Jacob. The question is, which of the sons of Jacob is going to take over the right of primogeniture and step into the line of blessing that has come down through Abraham? Is it going to be Judah, next in line after his brothers Reuben, Simeon, and Levi have been disqualified? Or will it be Joseph, who is the firstborn of Rachel? That's the question that 38 is going to go off and answer. Now again, we've talked about this every single time, because again, this is our basic assumption, is that the structure of Genesis gives us the interpretational keys that we need to understand the story with. And that's why we started with this second to last one, right? Where we basically went off and said, this verse here, belonging to that Toledo, as opposed to the introduction to this one, changes its interpretation drastically. Because it becomes a contrast to everything that's happened to Esau, as opposed to a throwaway verse introducing Jacob. And so here, we're now not just talking about how do we slot or how do we figure out the value of one verse. Now we're looking at what's the value of one chapter. That again, for most people, is simply thrown in there. And so we saw, when we started this in 37, we saw last week that there's this apparent contrast between Joseph and will be Judah, because we know that's what the story of 38 is about, right? In the same way that we saw with Esau and Jacob. We are introduced to them in conflicting ways. There's going to be a contrast between Esau and Jacob right at the beginning. We see this last week between Judah and Joseph. So with that, we're going to begin this process. So I want to start with this right here. What did we learn about Joseph last week in 37? Just throw out some of the things that we learned about his character.
He's naive.
Naive? I would agree with that for sure. It's going to be my last one. Other things that we know about Joseph?
Dreamer.
He's a dreamer. We're all dreamers. I'm going to sit there and say his dreams are what?
Inspired.
Inspired, exactly. Yeah, God, these are he receives dreams from God.
He's a little brat.
He's a brat, right? At least it seems like it, right?
He's favored.
He's favored for sure, right? Which means he's a brat. So, what other things?
He's pure.
He seems to be a good kid, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that pure is actually used of him. Okay, in 37, we can maybe make that argument in 39. Okay.
When he's with the fine wife.
Okay, but that's not 37. That's 39. So in 37, he's obedient. There you go. So now we've hit on all of them, right? So he is first and foremost, though, what? We're introduced to he is loved by his father. He is favored by his father, and then because of that, he is hated and separated from his brothers. This is a defining characteristic of him, right? But he is, as to the dream portion, he is chosen by God. What's he chosen by God to be, by the way? No.
Savior.
No. Read the story. What does God's dream tell him? Not that he's going to save anything.
He's gonna be.
He's gonna rule over,
He's going to have rule over his brothers and including his parents. He will have authority. Now, of course, what's been the interesting part of Genesis basically since the beginning? We've been looking for what? Who this kingly type of, who's going to rule, who's going to fix this problem, right? It seems like Joseph is the heir apparent to that idea. He is obedient, as we've mentioned. He is diligent, because when his brothers aren't where they're supposed to be, what does he do? He continues to investigate, right? And of course, I would sit there and say with you, he is naive, right? This is, I mean, it just seems, and again, I want to make sure you understand, the definition of naive is showing lack of experience, wisdom, or judgment. Now, if you read the rest of the story, does Joseph demonstrate wisdom and judgment?
Yes.
Clearly, right? So what do we mean by naive? He is what? Young and inexperienced, right? And so, what characteristic in the Bible text is actively used to describe him? Is he like Noah called righteous? Is he like Abraham called faithful? In chapter 37. If you're looking and wondering, the reason is because it's not there. Right? Interesting. If he is the nascent Messiah, he doesn't get any of the terms that you would sort of lump with him, right? Which would be righteous and faithful. So Joseph doesn't get those things. Now, what do we learn about Judah in chapter 37? We don't have a whole lot, right? Yeah, but we do have some stuff. What's the one thing we know about all the brothers?
They want to kill him.
He's kind of a leader. They look to him.
Well, not yet. Let's just stay with it, because again, we're going to be confronted with this idea of a group of people and then individuals. So as a group of people, they're all what?
Connivers.
Yeah, they're connivers, they're evil, right? That's the first verse, right? Because Joseph is in trouble because he tells his dad about their evil deeds. It's not translated that way, but that's essentially what it means, right? So they are evil, and of course, from this point forward, it only gets worse because they're like, either we're going to kill him or sell him into slavery. Those are bad deals, right?
But we talked about how
Keep going.
we talked about how we thought he had his brother's side by saying, oh, I don't want the brothers to kill him, but really it was his own self-absorbency of this.
Reuben, yeah, it's exactly. That's
Yeah.
Reuben who thinks to himself, hey, I'm going to be able to go off and do what? I can sort of spare myself if I save my brother, which is going to come up again.
Oh, that was Reuben?
That's Reuben.
I
Yeah,
got
it's
you.
not
And
Judah.
Judah
That's-
says, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood?
That's
Let's sell him.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's incredible evil, right? From my perspective. So they're hateful of him. They are what? Jealous, exactly right. Let's see what becomes of this dreamer's dream sort of a deal, right? If he's all this in a bag of donuts. Now, here's where I'm going to get in. I'm going to pick up on something specific to Judah. I would sit there and say he is self-centered and what? Impulsive. Now again, I'm basically struggling. I struggled all week with the correct word to put in here as the second portion of this, right? But Judah is this person who's looking at this situation, a brother in a pit waiting to die, and he decides, hey, you know what? There's something else that we can do, right? And so he is quick on his feet. He's impulsive in that sense, and to sit there and say, hey, wait, I got a better plan. It all still works. We just sell him off. We're done with him permanently, and we make money. And again, this just seems to be Judah at that moment in time, right? And from that perspective, since they all go along with him, he is given a sort of a leadership role among the brothers. They follow what he is suggesting, right? So he has enough woo with these people to bring them over and stuff like this, right? Now, again, one of the things that we're left with is that we were left with these two characters. We went through all the list of the brothers. We're left with two characters. At the end of chapter 37, we said there's only two brothers right now who are the heir apparents, Judah and Joseph. Who's winning? Joseph, clearly, by a mile, right? Judah's got zero character, right? Or the character he has is completely negative. And so you're left with this thing is to sit there and say, how is it possible that, because we know the end of the story, we know that Jesus comes from this line. How is it even possible that he comes from Judah's line? Chapter 38. That's where we're going to get into it, right? So from chapter 38 to the end of the book, right? There are only a handful of named speakers, okay? People, I mean, like in this case, Reuben has 2 lines. And this is picking up on Sherry's point, right? Didn't I tell you not to harm the boy, right? Then he goes off and says, you can kill my 2 sons if I don't bring him back to you, right? That's Reuben's lines in chapter, after 39 to the end of the book. Those are Reuben's lines. How many other brothers are there? 10 other brothers, right? Here's all the rest of their lines.
Nothing.
That's it.
Spokesman.
So, I mean, again, the story is going to revolve around who? Judah and Joseph. That's it. I mean, that's the whole point of this, right? Even Simeon, who's thrown in jail, even Benjamin, who's used as a foil, these 2 dudes don't even get a point to make, right? So, now we had the cliffhanger from last week, right, where we basically talked about this as a parenthetical. This is one parenthesis, this is the other parenthesis, except they kind of work in the opposite direction. Where we sit there and say the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Pharaoh, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, and then we picked up in 39:1, Joseph's been taken down to Egypt, to Potiphar, the Egyptian, Pharaoh, blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff is just this kind of cliffhanger. And as I've gone through this, is I have the only time I ever sniffed chapter 38 in a sermon was that we just skipped it. But they mentioned, hey, we're just skipping it because why? We don't need it. And there's this guy, Joseph, who talks about the Joseph narrative, E.A. Spicer, in his Genesis volume in the Anchor Bible Commentary series, basically characterized chapter 38 this way. It's a completely independent unit having no connection to the drama of Joseph, and it interrupts at the conclusion of Act 1. That is the typical approach to this, right? And so these then become the parenthetical parts of this, right? The material in the middle basically acting as what? A side note or an aside, disrupting the main flow of the event. Now this is the thing that irritates me the most, because I don't believe that that's the case. A lot of this comes because people basically have done what? They deconstructed scripture. Starting in the 1700s, the German liberal theologians basically are trying to combine what we're learning from science with what we're learning from scripture, and then basically deciding science is the authority over scripture, so now we need to do what? Well, Genesis doesn't really sit there and say it began this way, because we now know something new. And it begins this process of doing what? Deconstruction. And then you get into higher criticism, which then sits there and says, well, notice in chapter 1 of Genesis, nobody ever mentions the word Yahweh, but it's all through chapter 2. Those must be 2 different traditions. And it begins at the beginning. And when you see something like that, with that mindset, what do you say about chapter 38? It's a story. We don't know where to stick it. Spin the dial, stick it right in there, and let's move on. We need to record it because why? The last 4 verses. Why does it have to be in the Bible? Well, the last 4 verses of chapter 38 talk about what? What becomes of Jacob becomes what becomes of Judah, and what becomes of Judah is King David, and that's why we have to preserve the story. Well, we'll go run through a handful of these things. Medieval Jewish commentators, of course, if you want to, in my mind, if you really want to kind of figure out the best place to start, ask the people who studied it the longest, right? Medieval Jewish commentators interpreted the Joseph cycle with clues and basically said, hey, basically the real reason, the placement of Judah after Joseph was basically because of what? The intense grief of Jacob, and his brothers held him responsible. And again, that's where we start, right? You start off in 38, and you've got what? At that time, Judah left his brothers. And they'll read that to sit there and say Judah was what? Forced out of the clan because of why? His dad couldn't be consoled. Whose fault is this? Well, it must be Judah's fault. Well, back up. That's not how the story reads at all, right? Another considered the purpose was to contrast Joseph's conduct with Potiphar's wife with that of Judah's conduct with Tamar. That is actually important, but not the reason that the story is there. Martin Luther sees these 3 points. The sins are recorded to glorify the lineage of our blessed Lord who descended from such great sinners as we are. And again, this is we talked about this when we did the Matthew gospel. In Matthew, there are a handful of women mentioned. And both of them, one of them actually was a prostitute, one of them played a prostitute, Tamar, and what's her bucket? Rahab, thank you. It's too many Our Ladies. Rachel, Rebecca. I'm like going through all the Our Lady names I can come up with. So again, the other one is main reason is to teach us and to preserve the line of Christ. Okay, this would be Tamar ends up in David's line, ends up in the book of Ruth, etc., etc. And then he goes off and sits there and says this last one. He basically goes off and says that the Jews might have no reason to exalt themselves and despise Gentiles, for Christ is descended not only from Jews, but from the heathen that we are, from their perspective. What's the problem with this? Yes, Tamar is a Canaanite. Who does Joseph marry? We talked about this last week. Who do the other 10 marry?
No.
Yeah, if I had to bet $100, if I had to bet $1,000, I'd bet $1 million they were all Canaanites. Because none of them, we see no stories of them doing what? Heading back north to go find a wife, right? So the Jews, if you want to talk about when did we have the last of the pure Jews? Is these 12 dudes, and that's been it. So again, I get where he's sitting there saying, don't agree with it from that perspective. Now, modern scholarship goes off and sees 3 points. To impress the duties of Levirate marriage. Okay, great, because that's in Deuteronomy, and I'm sure Steve will cover this in great detail. But he's not going to. But one of the things that we know about Genesis, it is the foundation for the law. It should not surprise us when Lamech says if Cain is avenged sevenfold, that I will be avenged 77-fold, right? Sort of this idea of saying a limit to retribution. Why do we keep the Sabbath day holy? It's because of Genesis. You just go, why can I not kill somebody? It's because of Genesis chapter 9. The roots of a lot of the law are found in Genesis. And obviously this is a version of Levirate marriage, but they're under no obligation to the law at this point because there is no law. There won't be a law for 400 years after Abraham, right? So this is not exactly it in my mind. Again, the risk of assimilation, sons of God, daughters of men, this kind of wacky interpretation of Genesis chapter 6, the problem is what? Everybody's marrying Canaanite women. It's too late by this time. And then, of course, by contrast of Joseph and Judah. The last possible point, of course, then really becomes, and this is where everything lands on, they go back to what Luther said at the beginning, which is to simply sit there and say, it is in here because it's tribal history, and it's told through the convention of the story, and it's all because the great King David comes from this line. It's the same reason Ruth ends the way Ruth ends, it's the same way that this chapter ends the way this chapter ends. The last 4 verses of Ruth look like the last 4 verses of chapter 38. That's why it's here. Pure and simple. And I disagree. Because that's me. I'm like that. So if it's not an interruption or any of those other things, I'm going to sit there and say it's an interlude, right? My take on this chapter is it acts as an excursus. A literary excursus is a digression or a discussion of some point in a work of literature that is off of the main topic, right? And yet it is something that still provides what? A backstory. It may be used to lighten the mood. It allows the speaker, the narrator, to do what? Insert a point that you need to keep in your mind as we go through the rest of the material. And so I think this is much more, from a literary perspective, this is an excursus as much as anything else. And the important part of this excursus, if it is not to lighten the mood, it does what? It creates space for God to act. Just as he's acted in the past, he's going to act now in the life of Judah. So, when we get into, we're getting into this, I'm going to read through this for you, and then we'll take these things a couple of verses at a time. So, the book slows down at this point, or the story will slow down at this point a little bit. We're going to slow down at this point, so let's go through this. So, 38, 1 through 5. At that time, Judah left his brothers and settled near an Adulamite named Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. He took her as a wife and slept with her. She conceived and gave birth to a son, and he named him She conceived again, gave birth to a son, and named him Onan. She gave birth to another son, and named him Shelah. It was at Chezib that she gave birth to him. Right? So again, right off the bat, Judah is seen as a man of action. And again, who is mainly interested in himself. Just as he was fast to sell his brothers to the slave dealers, so he acts in chapter 38, basically without regards to others. We read that again, Judah saw there was a daughter of a Canaanite man whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her. Now, this is all told in a very, quick sort of a way, right? Nothing is basically going to distract from the primary but problematic focus on the subject of the appropriate channel for the seed. Because in a quick triad of verbs, Judah does what? Sees, takes, and lies with the woman, who then immediately does what? Conceives, bears, and names the firstborn. Everything from that perspective, we're still on this. Remember, from Genesis chapter 3:15, we've been on the hunt for the seed, right? And boom, Judah already has his firstborn son, okay? But the problem is what? It's just, we don't find anything about this that seems like it's normal. The normal euphemism for marital sexual intercourse is to know somebody. Judah is not described that way here, right? The name of his wife isn't even mentioned. She is the daughter of a certain person whose name is Shua. This poor woman never even gets a name, right? And again, these relationships that he goes through are all about what it is about for him, right? He has a son, he's good to go from that perspective. Now, I think some of the other things that are worth looking into, right, is again, back to this he goes into her, is a phrase that we're going to see in contrast throughout this whole section. It's the one phrase that's used again and again and again and again for every sexual act in this chapter. To know her is only used one time, after he's already had sex with Tamar. Okay? Chazib. This is an interesting thing. There's a lot of notes in the bottom of this. I'll basically kind of run through this real quick here. But this is not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament. We're not even sure exactly where it is. It's got to be in that general area, but there's nothing archaeological about it. There's nothing in the Old Testament about it. But its root word basically is disappointment, disillusionment, failing, or lying. So one of the things that I think that we need to think about is that this is an interpretation by synonym. The third son, Shelah, is born in Chazib. There's some argument that when he is born, Judah is not there. His wife is, but Judah isn't. Okay? Shelah is basically going to grow up and be what?
Orphan.
Yeah, he's a disappointment. Yeah, it's just he is either disappointed himself, or there's a delusionment around it because Tamar doesn't get him, he doesn't fulfill his promises to be the next in line, etc., etc. Or it's a call out against what? The character of Judah, who is failing and lying in these things. And so it's an interesting idea. So you can go through the notes in here and take a look at that and come to your own conclusion. We'll see this again with the word a name coming up later in the story. In 6 through 7, Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. Now, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. Okay? What's the sin of
Evilness.
Huh?
Evilness.
He's evil, right? But it only sits there and says what he did was evil in his sight.
Right.
Okay, same exact phrase that will be said of Onan. What is Onan's sin? It's sexual in nature, right? So from this perspective, I'm going to assume that it's a sexual sin of some sort, right? But nothing in the text suggests it's an extramarital type of a sin, right? It's not that is sleeping around, behind Tamar's back or anything like this, right? But what I'm going to suggest is that somehow has refused to impregnate Tamar. And in doing so, is treating her like a prostitute. Why would I go through and say some of these things? Well, because it fits the dang story, okay? This is exactly what Onan is going to do to his brother's wife, right? He is just going to use her for his physical pleasure. Tamar, her whole motivation in this entire story is to do what? I am here to produce children, is her purpose of life. Now I know that strikes our feminist ears very strangely, but this is in fact their worldview, right? That's what my job is. And I'm trying to do what? Preserve the line of Judah. I'm trying to extend it and keep it going on. And so the birth of sons, more important than anything else, because it does what? Keeps that line going. So again, from Tamar's perspective, what she is trying to get is not a husband, she is trying to get a child. Okay? And since that is not happening, and again, we treat sex for pleasure, and then we decide we'll have kids, right? Them, it's just the opposite. Sex is for having kids, and if it's pleasurable, great. And I think that also helps us understand a little bit about that weird phrase that you get from Sarah when she's really old. At this age am I to have pleasure from my husband? Because again, these two things, now he's interested in trying to do what? Have kids again, which means that he's going to be interested in having sex again. I think all this stuff is wrapped up into Er's sin. Again, more notes in here for you to take a look at. Onan's sin, we'll read through that real quick here, 8 through 10. Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and produce offspring for your brother. And again, notice what he's sitting there saying. He's not sitting there saying, take her as your husband. The purpose is what? Produce offspring for your brother. Onan knew the offspring would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he released his semen on the ground, so he would not produce offspring for his brother. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, so he was put to death as well. Again, exact same phrase in 10 that we saw for which to me says, because again, this is about economies, right? The Bible is going to use economies of words, that what Onan is doing is essentially what was doing, okay? And again, it reinforces our previous point, which was to sit there and say that Tamar's motivation and the culture's motivation is to do what? Produce offspring, okay? So again, this time the text is explicit. It is a sexual sin. Onan's deed is in the imperfect sense. It basically should be translated whenever he did this. And again, Onan is willing to use her flesh, but unwilling to give her children. And so again, he is also withholding pregnancy from Tamar. Again, contextually, I think that's what was doing as well. And again, the language that God uses of both boys is exactly the same verbatim. So we go on to chapter 38, verse 11. So Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he might die too, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Well, again, we've already been exposed to Jacob's extravagant process of mourning over the supposed loss of one of his sons, right? He can't be consoled. He tells everybody, you're going to take my gray hairs down into Sheol and mourning. It's over. My life is over, etc., right? From that point forward. What kind of response do we get from Judah for the loss of two boys?
Nothing.
We actually buried in the ground.
Nothing.
Not a word, not a peep. No mourning, no tearing of clothes, zilch.
He didn't though want Sheila to die, which is because he's attacking Tamar with some of the.
He's
like,
attaching to
stay
Tamar.
away
She's a
from
black
her.
widow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what this is, right? This is where we get that plot line from, right? She's a black widow. She's, if I give him to her, it's all over for this boy, right? Now again, what's interesting is we get the explicit dialogue and then this implicit or this internal dialogue about his reaction to her, as you're mentioning, right? Now, what do we get from Tamar? What reaction do we get from Tamar for this?
I'll live with.
She goes.
Go to his house.
Yeah, she's told to go and wait. She does what?
Right.
She goes and waits, right? So now again, I think one of the things that's interesting about this, right, is there is a designation of Tamar, right? In verse 11, what is it?
Widow.
Said to his
Daughter.
daughter-in-law. Meaning what? There is a continuing legal relationship between Judah and Tamar.
She should be in his house.
She should be in his house, exactly right.
She goes to her dad's house.
Goes back to her dad's house. He's going to do what? He's going to sequester her, right? And that's why I use that word up there, right? Again, what choice does she have? In her culture, not many, right? She's a childless widow, right? And so she's a little bit going to be, to pick up the Ruth story, a little bit like Ruth, right? So we move on, 12 through 14. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And so this is where people go off and sit and say, well, the lady's name is, the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. They think that Judah's wife's name is Shua. No. Verse 12 explains to us again, Judah's wife is the daughter of Shua. And she died. So she dies unnamed all throughout the whole story. When Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hiram the Adullamite went up to Timnah to the sheep shearers. Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she took off her widow's clothes, veiled her face, covered herself, and sat at the entrance in Nain, which is on the way to Timnath, for she saw that, though Sheila had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife, right? Now again, think about this. Years have passed in a handful of verses. We got to chapter, verse 11, and how many years have passed? A bunch, right? Because we had to have 3 boys grow up, Judah had to get married, Tamar, all the interaction, etc., etc. Now everything in this story is just going to grind to a halt, right? And it starts with this: Judah's wife dies. Why is this important?
He's available.
Well, yes, he's available.
No children.
No more children. Because this story is all about what? Children. It's all about an offspring. Everything about this has been about an offspring. Everything about Genesis is about what? Genesis chapter 3:15. Who is the seed? We're still answering the seed question. So it isn't about wives and husbands. It's about what?
Children.
Offspring, children. Who's going to be the Messiah, right? And Judah's wife is dead. How many more children is he going to get from his wife?
0.
0. Yes.
Did Tamar know that?
Yeah. Tamar is told, your father-in-law he's now, his wife has died, and now he's off on his own. So she's told that in verse, can't read that number. 13. Right?
Well, I meant, did she know that to the Jews there was the promise?
She was looking for the seed.
Yeah, so you can make some argument over whether or not, how much are they aware of the story and stuff like this, right? Now again, if you have a father, grandfather, and great-grandfather who've all interacted with Yahweh, I'm kind of thinking that you somehow know something about what's going on. But maybe not, right? And I would sit there and say, to a large extent, Tamar may not know that. She's simply acting from her cultural lens and perspective. Judah may also not know that, because so far we've seen nothing that shows that he is spiritually aware of what the heck's going on.
Isn't
Right.
she just seeking justice, really? Because a son would be her future.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's right. The child of that son would be, that's her future lineage, et cetera, right? This is the whole thing about Naomi and Ruth. When Ruth has a son, it accrues to Naomi's benefit, because she's already lost her boys. Now she has new boys.
It kind of goes, Judah is selfish.
Yeah.
He's looking to his own offspring. He's not looking for the seed, the
No.
offspring.
No.
He's looking for his own.
He's not exactly right. He's more like Esau in this story than anything else, right? And again, it's already set up in that way, because he marries what? He's the second person we specifically know marries a Canaanite. Exactly right.
But he also has a son
He has one son,
still.
but
in that line.
again, is he doing anything with Tamar regarding that son?
No.
No. Clearly, he's forgotten about Tamar. I
But
mean,
why wouldn't it come through that line of his first wife?
That's not how God's going to choose this story to run. And remember that we started this with God acts as He's acted in the past, right? So let's run through a couple of these points here. So again, Tamar has waited now a long time. Okay. Now, what's interesting is if you when we sit there and think about this, there's in between there is this idea of mourning, right? And yet it's a marginal note. This is the 3rd death that's been recorded in Judah's life. It's the first time we've seen the word mourning. If you read through it, there's no time modifier to it. It's like, and the time of mourning was done. It's like checkbox. Okay, I can't do anything for a week. It's like me with my LASIK or whatever that surgery I'm getting, right? Don't do anything but watch movies tomorrow. Okay, great. So Tuesday I can do something. This is the whole approach that you get with the idea of mourning here. He is not mourning in the sense of what we've seen with either Reuben or Jacob. It's just perfunctory, if that makes sense, right? So Tamar then decides it's time to do what?
Take action.
Take action, right? She has been deliberately neglected, right? And again, it's been reported to her in verse 12. Your father-in-law's off doing some stuff, right? And again, they keep using these words that imply a ongoing legal obligation. Daughter-in-law, father-in-law, right? Sort of a deal. So she hatches this crazy plan, right? And in this, it's interesting because her actions are described almost exactly like Rebecca's. It is this bang, bang, bang series of verbs. She takes off, she covers, she wraps, she sits down at a strategic location. When the only other time that we saw that kind of bang, bang, bang series of words was last time we saw it with Rebecca. When Rebecca was doing what?
Water
She was
she
deceiving,
Her husband. Yeah, she's working hard to make sure that Jacob is ready to go because they're going to deceive the father. Right? And again, I love the repetition, right? Now again, we get this location. The name also does not appear elsewhere in the Old Testament. So why does she sit in the entrance of a name? Well, it's another example of this wordplay, this understanding of trying to interpret through synonyms and stuff like this, right? The way that you would look at the root of this, you could well describe this as Tamar sitting in the opening of the eyes. Sitting in the opening of the eyes. What does that mean? Well, after all, she saw that Judah did not plan to give her Sheila, right? She also sees that Judah thinks she is a prostitute, right? And so we got this sort of wordplay on the fact that his eyes are open and yet he doesn't see her. Okay? And that seems to be, I think, kind of the wordplay. It's a subtle way of kind of maybe throwing in a little commentary on Judah at that moment of time again. So that's why it kind of makes me think that the previous word, Shazib, refers to the failing and lying of Judah, because all throughout here, what we're getting from the author is character assassination of Judah. He's just not with it. So, 15 through 19. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her and said, "Come, let me sleep with you." Which is, again, in the Hebrew is, let me come into you, right? The same thing that we had of the Judah saw the daughter and he slept with her. These are the exact same words, right? He did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me for sleeping with me?" "I will send you a young goat from my flock," he replied. But she said, "Hey, only if you leave me something until you send it." "Well, what shall I give you?" asked. She answered, "Your signet ring, your cord, and the staff in your hands." So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she got pregnant by him. She got up and left, removed her veil, put on her widow's clothes, and she's off to the races, right? It's the craziest part of the whole story, right? Because, I mean, stop and think about this, right? He doesn't recognize her enough when he sleeps with her. He doesn't hear her speak. You see what I'm saying? That's all part of the name, right? His eyes are open, but he doesn't see what's going on around him, right? So, basically, in this note, Judah takes the bait. She has set herself up in such a way, because she is thinking, again, somebody said over here, he's accessible, right? He's open to another marriage. I think really the point of this whole deal is to sit there and say he is what? He's got a sexual appetite that hasn't been fulfilled in a while, right? He's got boys who treat women like prostitutes. How do you think he treated his wife? Where do you learn these behaviors? A lot of times, right? So he's got some sexual needs that need to be met, and so basically, again, it's this very crass, blunt business. There's nothing nice about it. I just want to have sex with you. That's the opening lines to her, and of course, she basically sits there and says, "Look, I can't trust you. I know this personally." She doesn't say it, but she goes, "I know I can't trust you for the kid, for the goat, right? So I need something. I need a bigger pledge than just, hey, I'll send you a goat, right?" And so what does she get from him? Describe to me what you think that means.
His identity.
Yeah.
Things that will identify him.
That's exactly right. It is taking his driver's license and credit cards.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It is taking his driver's license and credit cards. And I'm like, are you going to get that back? Yeah, I'm going to get that back, right? Sort of a deal, right? But he is so hungry for what's to come, he's willing to pay the price, right? And again, both parties achieve their ends because he sleeps with her and she gets what? Pregnant, right? Now think about this, right? We got 3 more quick verbs here. He went in, she conceived. Bing, 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 right? This is in a book where how do the women conceive normally? Years of work. Barren, right? I have to trade for mandrakes, right? I have to have God open my womb, right? I have to be 100 years old. I mean, it's been a nightmare for the women in this book to become pregnant. And this girl, boom, one encounter at random. It's not sitting there saying that she is ready to have child. right? It's not that time of the month where she's like fertile, myrtle, you know? It's a big, you know, boom. It's just, everything comes together, and one time, bam, she's pregnant. Is she happy?
She's justified.
She got what she wanted, right? She got what she wanted. That was the important part of this, right?
Didn't that mean security for her too?
Well, it's going to reestablish in her mind the relationship she has with her father. And that's what comes up next.
Definitely.
And that's what comes up next, right? So now we're in verse 20. So Judah goes off and sends the young goat by his friend the Adulamite. This is Hira, in order to get back the items he'd left with the woman. But Hira couldn't find her. He asked them in the place, where's the cult prostitute? These are different words, prostitute and cult prostitute. It's not a modifier of prostitute. Okay, in the Hebrew, these are two completely separate words. Okay? So he has treated, so to use a better word, all through this whole thing, he comes to her and he sits there and says, just to use a better parlance here, where did that word go? Judah saw her, thought she was a prostitute. We would substitute the word whore. Okay?
Is it like a temple prostitute?
Hira upgrades her to a temple prostitute. Big difference.
But it's that pagan, like, fertility ritual of sheep
Oh.
shearing and.
Oh, yeah.
So Hiram's probably trying to make it like, no, it was just kind of a pagan rite rather
Exactly.
than.
Now, is it Hira or is it Judah? Isn't it interesting that Judah doesn't go back, but Hira does? We'll cover that in a second. Read that. But again, just make sure you understand. This is not cult prostitute like in our language we use a modifier. This is a completely separate word, right? He goes, where is the cult prostitute was besides the road of a name? Of course, they're like, there ain't no cult prostitutes here. There's no temple around here. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about, sort of deal, right? So the Adulamite then goes off and does what? He returns to Judah saying, and verbatim, I couldn't find her, and furthermore, the man in place said, there's no cult prostitute here, right? Again, this verbatim speech is so important to pay attention to, right? So what happens? Judah replies, let her keep the items for herself, otherwise we become a laughing stock. After all, I did send this young goat, but you couldn't find her. End of story, right? Judah did what he was supposed to do, wrapped up the whole deal, everything's good to go, right? So again, we talk about this idea of, you would sit there and say, Judah sends the pledge via his friend, but there's no temple prostitute here, right? There's also no simple prostitute here either, right? Because she isn't a prostitute, right? This is a woman who's been wronged, right? And so this is what we're supposed to infer from this whole deal, right? Now again, whether or not Judah relates the story to Hira and says it was a cult prostitute to make himself look better, or Hira decides to upgrade his friend's action into something that looks better, we're left to interpretation, right? But I could certainly see that Judah basically says to his friend, hey, she was a cult prostitute. Because why? Makes him look less animalistic from that perspective, right? So 24. Now we move to the grand climax of the story. 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has been acting like a prostitute. And again, that word would be, she's been acting like a whore, and now she is pregnant. Judah's response, bring her out, let her be burned to death. Again, it's stunning, right? His response to her harlotry in the Hebrew is reduced to just 2 words.
And the fact that he would overrule her dad, because she's in her own father's house.
Yeah. Again, all of a sudden, he's interested. He's interested in Tamar. Remember, we talked about this. I said, when you mentioned your statement, what's your name? I'm sorry.
Fran.
Not Fran, right? Not you.
Ruth.
You.
Ruth.
Ruth. Yes.
About security?
Yes, about security. This is where the relationship comes back into play. Until this moment in time, what has Judah thought about Tamar? 0.
Nothing, yeah.
Not a thing. She is not on his radar at all.
But now it's gonna make his name look bad.
Punishment should have been stoning, but again, that's a
That's a law.
law thing.
Okay.
It's a law thing, right? What did you say?
Said, but now he's interested because that makes his name look bad.
That's right. Because again,
This is all about him.
still all about him. Again, he's a selfish individual. Everything is revolving around him, right? And again, we keep seeing what? What's the other thing that what's how this whole thing introduced, right? Your daughter-in-law, Tamar. Again, do we know that Tamar is his daughter-in-law? Yes. We learned that right there in verse 3, right? I mean, that's what she's been his daughter-in-law since, and this is the third time that we've seen that phrase used of her. Why? The author wants us to know what? This ongoing legal connection, right? So again, Judah's response is Judah happy with this? Yes.
Yes.
I think he is.
Gets it
Why?
out from under that obligation.
Doesn't have to ever worry about
And
giving
the
her to
lies
Selah.
and everything else.
And
She is.
And he's got son, and he's gonna have children.
He has a son.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to worry about him dying with her.
Right.
She's obviously the problem, right? And now she's a whore. Poof. Just wipe my hands of this whole deal and move on, right? I'll get us another wife for Selah and things will be okie dokie, right? So I think he's pretty darn happy about this whole deal, right? From that perspective.
For the moment.
Huh?
For the moment.
For the moment, exactly right. So again, he takes this really credible position, right? This I mean, it's an obnoxious position, right? But to sit there and say, hey, let's just wipe these people out, right? Bring her out, burn her to death.
I think he could be incensed because he just committed the same sin, and when you do that, you're often very harsh on people who commit something similar.
That is true. There is this idea of projection, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think that's Judah's mindset, unfortunately. Judah has shown zero spiritual maturity in this thing whatsoever, right? So I like the generosity that you're displaying toward Judah. Personally, I'm not gonna be leaning in that direction. So now 25 and 26. Well, as she's being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message: I'm pregnant by the man to whom these items belong. I love it, right? I don't know who this dude is. I don't know who this dude was either.
That's clever.
If you don't know who I am, I'm gonna sit there and say, I don't know who you are. I love that, right? Again, remember the 5 themes that we talked about in Jacob's life? The last one was something called talionic justice, symmetrical poetic justice. You don't know who I was? I don't know who you were. That's the implied statement there. I love it so much.
So tell me whose stuff this is.
So you tell me whose stuff this is. So examine these things. Whose signet, ring, cord, and staff are these? It is genius. It is utter genius, right? I love it, right? And of course, Judah does what? He recognizes these things. It says, she is more in the right than I. Again, you may have different translations, but I like how the CSB did this. She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her my son Selah. And he did not know her intimately again. This is the first time we get the true sort of relational, sexual relation euphemism. To know somebody it's just the marital sexual act, right? So, let's run through our points here, right? What's interesting is that this is the exact same thing that Judah and his brothers pulled on their father. Examine, recognize, right? The first 2 references, Jacob is involved with both. Use the verb in an act of deception. In this third act of it, it is used as an act of unmasking. She was covered, so was he in his anonymity. It's all been uncovered. Her covering is off, now his is off as well, right? Again, this is talionic justice. The deceiver is deceived. Is particularly fitting since, again, both instances with Judah and his brothers and Jacob, Tamar and Judah, both were done through objects that did what? Identified the victim. Right? And so when Judah goes off and says that, she is more in the right, this is not a moral judgment like we would go off and tend to think of, right? The Hebrew word that we're always interested in for righteousness is Sadiq, right? We've seen that word used one time of one person in Genesis. Does anybody remember who that was? Where I said his name? Noah, right? And it's only been used of one other person in the book of Genesis. When Abraham's arguing with God about the people in Sodom, what if there are 5 righteous, 10 righteous, or 50 righteous people? And of course, who is he thinking of? The one righteous person, Lot, which is where Peter picks up on it finally, because you can find no evidence that Lot is a righteous person except from Peter or from Abraham. And so this is not Sadiq, right? This is Sadak. It's a little bit different, right? But again, what he's basically sitting there saying is that in light of their social customs and the various duties that were implied when he sat there and said, I'm going to give you Onan for this reason, right? Tamar's actions are justified. They're justifiable. His are not. right?
Was he actually admitting he was wrong?
Yes, he's saying she is the innocent party and I'm the guilty one.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it is a stunning
No,
note.
Tyson said she's more in the
Well,
wrong.
right, yes.
Exactly right.
Because he's still an idiot.
He's still an idiot. He's still an idiot, right? Now again, here's the point of this, right? Judah's verdict is the normative way that we're supposed to look at this. This is important. As opposed to Moses coming out and saying it, he's then done what? He's put it in the mouth of the protagonist of the story, right? Which is Judah in this case. And so he gives Judah's speech that's supposed to tell us how we are supposed to think about this situation. We are not supposed to argue with Judah in this moment, because it is the narrator's main point. It's the normative point that we're supposed to take. So the last 4 verses. Things get a little bit stranger. Now, when the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. The midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread around it, announcing this one came out first. Again, is that how children are born?
No, not normally.
But he pulled his hand back. His brother came out first, and she said, wow, you broke it out first. So he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had that scarlet thread tied around his hand, came out, and his name was Zerah. That's the end of the story. Bing, bing, all over. What in the wide world of pork is the point of that, right? Well, of course, it's twins. Who else were twins? Esau and Jacob. Contrasts, right? The birth is a spectacle, not to say the least, right? It's not just, for this perspective, right? It's the 2x4 across Judah's eyes by God to sit there and say, what? The younger is going to be chosen over the what? Older. And we already know that Joseph is younger than Judah. Now, I want to nail this down. Parallels. There's a whole, and I don't have a bunch of time here, so we'll go through this quickly, but there are a bunch of parallels in this deal, right? The use of separation from one brother from the rest. At that time, Judah left his brothers and settled near the Adulamite. Joseph has been taken from his brothers, right? The recurrence of turn towards. At the time, Judah left his brothers and settled. Settled is this word, turn towards. Of course, in 38:16, he does what? He turns toward her, right? He turns toward her. That's what went over to her. Again, this combination of things in this deal. The symmetry of the use of young goat, right? Go to the flock. This is back in what? This is Rachel. This is Rebecca and Jacob with Isaac. Go to the flock and bring me 2 young goats, right? She put the skin on the young goats. Of course, I will send you what? A young goat. And of course, if you go further, right? The boys kill in 37:31 a male goat to provide the blood that they need to go off and deceive their father. So again, of all the animals, it's always the same, right? The double parallelism of find. This is of Joseph. He's out. He's like, I'm looking for my brothers. I can't find them. I'm looking for my brothers. I can't find them. And then of course, what? The Adulamite goes and they can't find them and comes back and verbatim says, I can't find them. Right? Again, why isn't Jacob going and looking for his sons? Where are they?
On the field.
No, it's in a field near what? Shechem. What's wrong with him going to Shechem? He goes off and sits there and says what? Remember back in 34:30, he goes, I'm odious to these people. He doesn't want to be killed. So he does what? He sends his son. Disastrous decision, right? Of course, Judah, I think he's embarrassed. You can sit there and say, Jacob's embarrassed to go here or worried about going here. Same thing with Judah. He doesn't go. If I'm him, I'm like, hey, I'm going to take care of this nice and quiet. But he's embarrassed. To your point, if you want to go off and use this as a point to reference yours idea, he sends his friend, but again, the parallelism, right? Somebody acting in his stead, I can't find these people, right? And contrasts, right? Again, Jacob tearing his clothes, refusing to be consoled. He mourns for his sons for many days. Everything we know about Judah, right there, right? Men how are they comforted? All his sons and daughters try to comfort, but he refuses to be comforted, right? Here, again, the idea when he had finished mourning, he decides, how is he going to comfort himself? Let's go take part of these spring rituals. Men will be men. And again, the contrast of the men they are tempted. Judah goes over and sees her and says, let me sleep with you. Joseph, of course, to the point, they're saying what? Flee immorality, right? These things are very big. But the biggest one, of course, is Nakar. This is we started off with, this is our light word. This is our word motif for this section, and we already did this in 27:23. He did not recognize him. This is Isaac because his hands were hairy. In 37:32, they sent the robe of many colors to their father and said, "We found this, examine it," which is to say Nakar. 37:33, his father recognized it, which is again to say Nakar. We're ready to add 2 more verses to this list. In 38:25, she's brought out, she goes, "Examine them," that is Nakar. Whose are these things? And of course, the very next verse, 38:26, he recognized them, Nakar, right? The point of the parallels and of the symmetrical contrasts is that 38 is not some random story just thrown in the middle of this thing. There's way too much connective tissue. This thing has been built specifically to fit the warp and woof of everything in Jacob's life, from when he deceives his father all the way to the end. It is a stunning portion of this. What's interesting is we're not done with Nakar, because it plays an important part next. And of course, really what we're looking for here is to sit there and say, Genesis 38 asks us the question of whether or not is Judah qualified to take the leading role among his brothers, especially as it regards to the promise of the Messiah. At the end of chapter 38, what's our conclusion? No, there's no way, right? I mean, you thought he was bad for selling his brother. 38 does not make him any better. Would you agree?
Yeah.
He makes one nice statement at the end, but man, it's a hot mess. He is a dumpster fire of a character, right? And again, knowing that, and that it belongs here, the question then is now, what is its real purpose? And that's what we're going to cover next week. So, not next week, because next week is what? Thanksgiving. We're off, so we'll pick this up.